Hi, my name is Jessica, and I am a 34-year-old school teacher. Life was fairly straightforward with a simple routine. Wake up, teach kids, come home, and spend a quiet evening with my husband, Steven, who worked as a manager at an energy company. But all of that changed dramatically one evening, about 5 years into our marriage. It was just another Tuesday night. Steven came home looking unusually solemn, and after dinner, he dropped the bombshell. "Jessica, we need to talk," he said, his tone so grave it cut through the noise of the dishwasher. "What's up? Everything okay?" I asked, trying to meet his eyes, which seemed fixated on something distant, troubled. He took a deep breath and finally looked at me. "It's about Mom. She's alone in that old house since Dad passed. I think we should move in with her." My heart sank. Move in with Angela? The idea alone made my stomach twist uncomfortably. Angela and I had never really seen eye to eye. Our relationship was cordial at best, frosty at most times. Move in with Angela? I echoed, disbelief and a hint of irritation coloring my tone. "Steven, are you serious? You know Angela and I barely get along." He leaned against the kitchen counter, his gaze firm and imploring. "I know, Jess, but she's my mom, and she's really struggling. Plus, we're just wasting money on this rented apartment." "But this is our home, Steven. Our space," I argued, my voice rising slightly in frustration. "Moving in with your mom, it's a whole different ballgame." He nodded, understanding the challenge but still pushing for it. "I get it, and I wouldn't ask if I didn't think it was necessary. It's not just about the money, Jess. It's about family. Mom needs us." As much as I wanted to protest, the resolve in his voice and the sincerity in his eyes made it hard to keep arguing. Family did need to stick together, after all. But as I nodded slowly, giving in to the inevitability of it all, a part of me dreaded what was to come. Living with Angela wasn't just going to be a challenge, it was going to test everything Steven and I had built together in our 5 years of marriage. The moving day arrived with a chilly breeze that seemed to mirror my apprehensions. As we packed our belongings, each box felt like a step away from the life we had known, a step towards an uncertain new chapter. Steven was all business, focusing on logistics, perhaps to avoid the tension simmering between us. We arrived at Angela's house late in the afternoon. The house itself was an imposing old structure, its facade marked by the passage of time. The windows looked out like weary eyes, and the garden, once meticulously cared for, now lay somewhat neglected. It felt like stepping into a different era. Angela was waiting at the door. Her greeting was polite but stiff, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to my home," she said, her voice carrying a formality that set the tone. "I expect you to respect my ways." As I crossed the threshold, a sense of foreboding washed over me. This wasn't just a house, it was a realm where Angela reigned, and her rules governed. The first few weeks were as tough as I had feared. Angela had a comment on everything I did, from the way I arranged the kitchen to how I folded the laundry. "Don't put the dishes away like that," she would say, or "You're overwatering the plants." Her voice, always laced with a hint of disapproval, followed me like a shadow. One evening, after a particularly long day, her critique about my cooking snapped the last strand of my patience. "The soup is too salty," she declared as she pushed her bowl away. Later that night, in the privacy of what was now our bedroom, I exploded in frustration to Steven. "I can't do a damn thing right for your mother. It's like living with a drill sergeant." Steven, weary and rubbing his temples, tried to bridge the gap with reassurances. "Jessica, just give it time. She's old and set in her ways." I tossed and turned in bed that night, the echoes of the house creaking around me. It wasn't just the physical space that felt alien. It was the relentless scrutiny, the feeling of never being quite good enough. And amidst all this, Steven seemed increasingly withdrawn, retreating into his shell, leaving me to fend for myself in what felt like an emotional battlefield. As days turned into weeks, the house with its echoing halls and cold, watchful eyes began to suffocate me. Angela's presence loomed large, her standards a high bar I continually failed to reach. I missed our old apartment, our routines, the simplicity of our old life, just Steven and me against the world. Now, it felt like Stephen and Angela against Jessica, and I was losing ground fast. One particularly gloomy afternoon, as I tried to lose myself in a book to escape the heavy atmosphere, Angela entered the room, her footsteps deliberate. "Jessica, we need to talk about how you manage the housekeeping. There are standards to maintain if you're going to live under my roof." Her words, meant to instruct, felt more like chains tightening around me. This wasn't just a move. It was a takeover of the life I knew, the independence I cherished. And as I looked out the window at the fading light, the shadows in Angela's house seemed to deepen, mirroring the growing despair in my heart. The weeks blurred into a monotonous routine of tending to Angela's needs and trying to adapt to her stringent house rules. My teaching job, once a refuge that offered me a sense of purpose and identity, now felt like the only thread connecting me to a life I once knew, a life that was slowly slipping away. It was on a lazy Sunday afternoon, amidst the backdrop of Angela's sprawling but stern garden, that Stephen approached me with a somber expression. I was pruning the roses, enjoying the rare solace the garden provided, when I heard his footsteps on the gravel path. "Jessica, we need to talk," Stephen said, leaning on the old iron gate. His tone bore a gravity that immediately set my nerves on edge. "What now, Stephen?" I asked, feeling a knot form in my stomach. He took a deep breath, the weight of his next words seeming to press down upon him. "I think you should quit your job and stay home," he said slowly, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "We're spending a fortune on a nurse and housekeeper for Mom. It makes more sense for you to take over those roles." The shears in my hand paused mid-snip. Quit my job. The idea struck me like a physical blow. Teaching wasn't just a job to me, it was a calling, a vital part of who I was. Stephen continued, oblivious to the turmoil he had just stirred within me. "I know you love teaching, but consider this. It'll make things easier around here, financially and logistically." "Stephen, teaching is not just about the money," I replied sharply, my voice rising with emotion. "It's about what I love, what I'm good at. You're asking me to give up a huge part of myself." He ran his fingers through his hair, a gesture of frustration and exhaustion. "I know, Jess, but think about it. It's for the best. We need to do what's practical right now." Practical. The word echoed mockingly in the quiet of the garden. What was practical for Stephen seemed like a sacrifice to me, a sacrifice of my dreams, my passions, and my independence. "Stephen, I can't believe you're asking this of me," I said, the hurt clear in my voice. "How can you think it's okay to ask me to just give up everything I care about?" He sighed, a sound of weariness and entreaty mingling together. "It's not forever, Jess. Just while we get things settled with Mom. Please, I need your support in this." Support. Another word that now tasted bitter. I looked around at the garden, at the home that was slowly becoming a prison, and felt a profound sense of loss. Was this what our life was going to be? Giving up pieces of myself one by one until there was nothing left but the role I played for others? I put down the shears and wiped my hands on my apron, my decision heavy on my heart. "Okay, Stephen," I finally said, the fight draining out of me. "I'll quit my job." Stephen's face showed a mixture of relief and sorrow. "Thank you, Jess," he said, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "It means a lot to me." As he walked back to the house, I stayed in the garden a while longer, letting the tears fall freely for the first time in weeks. I had agreed to his request, but at what cost? In trying to keep our little family together, I felt as though I was slowly losing myself, piece by piece, until I wasn't sure what would be left. The days following my decision to quit teaching were filled with a quiet grief. Each morning as I watched the neighborhood children, backpacks slung over their shoulders, walking to school, a part of me yearned to join them. Instead, I turned back to the confines of Angela's house, to a routine that now revolved around caregiving and housekeeping roles that were never mine by choice. Angela's health began to fail more noticeably, her needs increasing as her independence dwindled. I found myself managing medications, scheduling doctor's appointments, and assisting with daily tasks that Angela, once a formidable matriarch, could no longer handle alone. The intimacy of care, which should have brought us closer, instead built a wall of resentment between us. Her frustration at her own frailties often made her more critical, and I bore the brunt of her sharp tongue. Stephen, meanwhile, seemed more distant than ever. His late nights at work became more frequent, and when he was home, his presence was as hollow as the echoing hallways of the house. Our conversations, once filled with shared plans and laughter, had dwindled to logistical exchanges over meals or Angela's health. One evening, unable to bear the growing silence between us, I confronted him. It was after dinner, and Angela had retired to her room. The house was quiet, too quiet, and every tick of the clock seemed to mark the widening gap in our marriage. "Stephen, what's going on with you? You're hardly here, and when you are, it's like you're not even my husband anymore," I said, my voice low but firm. He avoided eye contact, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly as if it held the answers to our marital woes. "Work's a nightmare right now, Jessica." "Just piles of stress," he muttered, his response mechanical. "I get stressed, Stephen, but this feels like you're shutting me out." "You're here, but you're not really here," I pressed, needing to break through his detachment. He exhaled heavily, finally looking up with a weariness that seemed to age him. "I don't know what you want me to say, Jessica. I'm just really tied up with stuff." Stuff. The word was as vague as it was inadequate. I wanted to scream, to shake him out of his apathy, but the defeated look in his eyes stopped me. It was clear he was struggling, yet his refusal to let me in, to share his burden, felt like a betrayal. The conversation ended with no resolution, as had become the norm. We cleaned up the kitchen in silence and retreated to our separate corners of the house, together yet profoundly alone. The breaking point came unexpectedly on a Thursday afternoon. I was cleaning out the attic, a task Angela had insisted upon, when I stumbled upon a box of old family photos. The images, faded and worn, showed a younger, happier Angela, and among them, pictures of Stephen as a child. His smile was carefree, a stark contrast to the strained man he had become. As I sifted through the memories, a wave of sorrow washed over me. This house, Angela's domain, was suffocating us both, erasing the vibrant people we once were. I realized then that something had to change. We couldn't go on like this, living as shadows of ourselves, trapped in a past that was Angela's, not ours. That evening, when Stephen came home late again, I was waiting for him in the living room, the box of photos by my side. "We need to talk," I said, the words echoing those he had used so many times before. This time, it was I who needed to lay bare the truth of our crumbling marriage. He looked tired, but he nodded, settling down opposite me, bracing himself. "Stephen, we're losing each other," I began, my voice trembling with emotion. "This house, the constant care for Angela, your absence, it's pulling us apart." He didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the photos scattered on the coffee table. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but raw. "I know, Jess. I just don't know how to fix this. Maybe we start by being honest with each other, by being here, fully, not just physically, but with all that we are," I suggested, hope mingling with fear in my heart. Stephen reached out, his hand covering mine, a gesture so simple yet so profoundly missed. "Let's try," he agreed, the weight of our shared love and pain clear in his eyes. It was a small step, an agreement to try, but it felt like a lifeline thrown across the chasm that had opened between us. Whether it would be enough to save us, I didn't know, but it was a start. The following months brought a delicate balance of hope and hardship. Stephen and I began to carve out moments for ourselves amidst the caregiving duties, trying to rebuild the bridges we had let crumble. Yet, the weight of Angela's increasing demands and her declining health loomed ever larger, a constant reminder of the life we had temporarily set aside. It was during one of these trying times, on a drizzly afternoon that mirrored my mood, that Angela's condition worsened significantly. I had just helped her back to her room after a painstaking attempt at walking in the garden, her frailty more pronounced than ever. As I adjusted her pillows, trying to make her comfortable, she looked up at me with a mixture of frustration and fear in her eyes. "Thank you, Jessica," she murmured, her voice weak but laced with a rare warmth. It was moments like these, brief and bittersweet, that reminded me why we had made the sacrifices we did. But as days turned into weeks, the strain grew unbearable. Angela's needs intensified, and it became clear that she required professional care. Stephen, caught between his responsibilities at work and his mother's health, grew more distant again, retreating into his shell of stress and silence. The breaking point came unexpectedly. Angela suffered a severe stroke one evening while attempting to navigate her way to the bathroom. The terror in her eyes as she slumped to the floor, unable to speak or move, haunted me as I called for an ambulance, my hands trembling with dread. At the hospital, the doctors were grim about her chances of recovery. As I sat beside her bed, watching her struggle even to acknowledge my presence, I felt a deep, consuming sadness. This vibrant, if often difficult, woman who had ruled her home with such iron will was now a shadow of herself, dependent on machines and the mercy of medicine. Stephen arrived late, his face drawn, his eyes hollow. As we stepped outside the hospital room to talk, the cold hospital corridors seemed to echo the chill in my heart. "Jessica, I can't deal with this," Stephen said abruptly, his voice flat. "I have enough on my plate at work and now this. I just can't." I stared at him, disbelief and anger warring within me. "You can't deal with this?" "Stephen, she's your mother." He shrugged, his usual warmth absent. "Yeah, and she's been a burden for years. This is just the cherry on top." His words cut deep, and I recoiled as if slapped. "She's not a burden, Stephen. She's family. She needs us now more than ever." He laughed, a bitter sound that chilled me to the bone. "Us? No, Jessica. She needs you. I've got other things to handle." I watched him walk away, a part of me wanting to call him back, to demand he face his responsibilities. But another part of me knew it was futile. Stephen had made his choice, and I was left alone to shoulder the burden he refused to share. In the weeks that followed, I dedicated myself to Angela's care. Her recovery was slow and fraught with setbacks, but I was determined to be there for her, to give her the dignity she deserved in her vulnerable state. Then came the day of the will reading, a day I approached with a heavy heart. As Angela's lawyer unfolded the documents, Stephen and his sister Janet stood by, their expressions a mix of curiosity and greed. The lawyer cleared his throat. "I am here to read the last will and testament of Angela." Stephen's posture stiffened, his eyes fixed on the lawyer, anticipating what he believed was his rightful inheritance. Janet, equally expectant, watched with barely concealed impatience. "To my daughter-in-law, Jessica," the lawyer began, and the room went still, "I leave the entirety of my estate, including the house and all its contents." The shock was palpable. Stephen's face went from smug anticipation to stunned disbelief. Janet's mouth fell open, her eyes darting between the lawyer and me. "This can't be right," Stephen exclaimed, his voice loud in the quiet room. She was our mother. How could she leave everything to her?" Janet was fuming. "This is some mistake. She couldn't have meant this. We'll contest this. There's no way we're letting her get away with this." As they stormed out, their threats and protests ringing in my ears, I stood there, alone in the echoing room, holding the will in my trembling hands. The house that had been my prison was now my inheritance, a final gesture from Angela that spoke volumes of her recognition and gratitude for my care. But as I looked around at the walls that had witnessed so much pain, so much change, I realized that Angela's legacy was not just about material wealth. It was a testament to endurance. As the dust settled from the turmoil of the will reading, the house felt more like an echo chamber of the past than a sanctuary. Angela's passing had left a profound void, and with Stephen and Janet's wrath simmering just beneath their surface of shock and betrayal, the atmosphere was charged with a tense anticipation of further conflict. In the quiet moments alone in the house, I found myself wandering through the rooms, each corner filled with memories of Angela's commanding presence and the battles fought, both small and significant. Now, with every step, the weight of her final act pressed upon me, a mixture of vindication and overwhelming responsibility. The days following were a blur of legal consultations and cold encounters with Stephen and Janet. Their threats to contest the will hung over my head like a dark cloud. But amidst the legal chaos, a deeper transformation was taking place within me. The house, once a symbol of my oppression and sacrifice, began to represent something else, a chance to redefine my life on my own terms. One crisp morning, as I stood looking out over the garden that I had once tended with resentment, but now saw with new eyes, I made a decision. It was time to let go of the past and embrace the future. I would start by renovating the house, not just as a place to live, but as a symbol of my new journey. I hired contractors to update the old, dreary interior, choosing bright colors and modern fixtures to replace the outdated decor. Each stroke of paint and each new piece of furniture felt like a step away from the shadows of Angela's stringent rules and Stephen's indifference. As the house transformed, so did I. I reconnected with old friends and reached out to colleagues, slowly rebuilding the professional and personal life I had put on hold. The community around me, which I had once held at arm's length, now welcomed me with support and kindness. It was as if Angela's final gift had opened more than just a literal door. It had opened a door to new possibilities. The finality of my decision came one afternoon when I met with Stephen to discuss the remaining details of the estate settlement. His demeanor was cold, his bitterness palpable. "Jessica, you think you've won, don't you?" "Taking everything, my mother's house, her money," he accused, his voice harsh. I looked at him, not with anger, but with a calm clarity. "Stephen, I didn't win anything. Angela made her choice, and it was not about winning or losing. It's about what she felt was right." He shook his head, unable to meet my gaze, and after a few moments of tense silence, he left, the finality of our fractured relationship sealed with his departure. The weeks turned into months, and as the house neared completion of its transformation, so did my sense of self. I started teaching again, part-time at first, then gradually taking on more as my confidence returned. The joy of engaging with students, the fulfillment of pursuing my passion, it all came flooding back, reminding me why I had loved teaching so much. One late autumn evening, as I sat in the newly redecorated living room, the setting sun casting warm hues through the large windows, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The house, once a battleground of wills and emotional warfare, was now truly my home, a place of light and warmth. I realized then that Angela's will had been more than just a transfer of assets. It was her way of acknowledging my sacrifices and offering me a chance to forge a new path. In her own way, she had seen the strength in me, even when I had doubted it myself. The journey was not without its scars, but as I looked around at the walls that now echoed with laughter instead of disputes, I knew that I was ready to move forward, carrying the lessons of the past with me, but no longer bound by them. Angela's legacy was not just in the material wealth she had left behind, but in the resilience she had unwittingly instilled in me. And as I finally stepped out of the shadows of the past, I embraced the light of my new beginning, ready to write the next chapter on my own terms.